Revolutions of 1848, A Social History by Priscilla Robertson, book review. So with apologies, I'm going to start this off from the very basics, kind of explaining what the revolutions of 1848 are, because you never know who might be watching this video. Apologies to anyone who doesn't need this background information. So when I was in high school, I learned about the French Revolution. And that was about as far as my high school education went. I thought, okay, France was under a king, then they had the revolution, and then it became a republic. But in actuality, 19th century French history was a lot more messy than that. And this was something I didn't learn until I was in college. But there was a French Revolution, and then that ended in the age of Napoleon, and then the king came back, and then there was actually another revolution. And then they changed the kings, and then there was another revolution, and then there was a republic, and then there was Napoleon again, and then there was another revolution. There was a lot of revolutions going on in France. So there wasn't just one French Revolution. During the 19th century, there were many French revolutions. For example, the Les Miserables, the scene when they're on the barricades. Some people think that that was the French Revolution, but that was actually just one of the many Republican uprisings that happened during the 19th century. In fact, Les Miserables was one of the minor uprisings that nobody would remember today if Victor Hugo hadn't written a book about it. All right, but 1848. In 1848, there was a revolution in France, another one, and it spread out all across Europe. All of a sudden, just about every major European city, many major European cities, had revolutions. It would just pop, 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 all over Europe. All these revolutions happening all in the same year. And it's kind of a fascinating subject, and this is something that has long fascinated me. I guess revolutions in general tend to go in waves. So whenever there's a major revolution in one country, it inspires other revolutions or other uprisings in other countries. And to a certain extent, every major uprising has this. You know, like the French Revolution, the original one, sparked a bunch of minor uprisings in other countries. The Russian Revolution in 1917 sparked some uprisings in different countries. But every now and again, there's a big one which just spreads and sparks major uprisings in other countries. The other notable examples, maybe, are 1968, where like in 1 year you had student protests in all these cities all over the globe. In 1989, which was mostly the Soviet countries or the communist countries, but you had all these democratic revolutions in communist countries, again all over the globe: Russia, Eastern Europe, Germany, China. And then I guess the most recent one we've seen is the Arab Spring, where you had one uprising in one Arab country and then it spread to a bunch of others. Now, 1968, because it's within living memory and because it was important to the people who lived through it, tends to be the one we hear the most about nowadays, at least in America, at least when I was growing up. For example, that Chris Harman book, The History of the World, which I reviewed recently, was a history of the whole world in 600 pages, and he gave a whole 10 pages to 1968. But, you know, he lived through it, so it must have been important to him. But 1948 really makes 1968 look like nothing, because you know what really happened in 1968? There were a bunch of protests, students occupied universities, but no governments were actually toppled. In 1848, governments all over Europe were toppled. Even the Pope had to flee during 1848. So this was like, you can see this was a big thing. Nobody talks about it nowadays. I mean, aside from history nerds, it's largely considered a footnote to history. And perhaps one of the reasons why that is because none of these Republican revolutions lasted. Many of them collapsed within that same year, 1848, or the next year, 1849, but by 1851, definitely. The whole thing was squashed. All the Republican governments had been put down, and the king and the pope and everybody was back into power. So it was, it was a really big deal, and then all of a sudden it was all over. But yeah, I just find it fascinating. Now, I have, because I'm fascinated by this subject, tracked down a few different books on this, or picked them up in bookstores, etc. But I've not read any of them from cover to cover. And the reasons are, the other books that I've picked up on this subject are analytical histories. And in other words, they don't tell it as a story. They say, okay, what were the conditions? How many people were working in factories during this time? Kind of boring analytic history. And to a certain extent, that makes sense, because the thing about 1848 is not just why did a revolution happen in one country, but why did the revolution happen in all these countries? So it is worth taking an analytic approach to it to see what was it about this particular year that caused that revolution to spread. Sorry, I'm battling a bit of a sore throat, so bear with me here. I'm going to be drinking from this water throughout. But I just find that boring to read. Priscilla Robertson's book, however, is a narrative history. She tells us like a story, which makes it much more interesting to read. The subtitle is A Social History. So it's Revolutions of 1848, A Social History. But that's kind of a misnomer. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, look up Revolutions of 1848, they have this book listed in their bibliography at the bottom. And then somebody has written besides this book, despite the title, it's not really a social history or something like that. It's much more of a narrative history where she tells she tells a bunch of stories about what's happening in each city. This is also a classic history. This was originally published way back in 1952, but you can still find it in bookstores nowadays. The last time I was back in America, I was in the history section of my local bookstore, and this book is still being sold. So it's one of those history classic books that stayed in print. Now, what Priscilla Robertson does is she focuses on cities where the revolutions broke out and then tells a story of each individual city. Not all of them, of course. It would be impossible to cover every single 1848 revolution in one book. As Priscilla Robertson herself says, quote, "No one has ever numbered the revolutions which broke out in Europe in 1848. But there must have been over 50. So she can't possibly tell the story of all of them. But what she does is she narrows her focus to France, Germany, the Austrian Empire, including a section on Hungary, which had a unique status in the Austrian Empire at that time, Italy, and then she gives a short afterwards on Britain and Ireland. There was no revolutions per se in Britain and Ireland, but there was unrest in 1848. Excuse me. But even within these major countries, there are many different revolutions. So there wasn't just like one revolution in Germany or one revolution in Italy. There were several different revolutions in different German or Italian cities. So within these various sections, she's got it broken down into chapters. For example, in the section on Italy, she's got chapters on Milan and Rome and Venice. Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to this approach. The advantages are that Robertson is an excellent storyteller, and she's able to make the history come alive and build up a lot of suspense in the narrative. As a reader, I found myself constantly turning the pages to find out what was going to happen next. She makes the whole thing very enthralling and quite readable. The disadvantage, though, is because there are so many revolutions, different revolutions within this one book, every 75 pages or so, roughly on average, you get yanked out of one city, and then you get deposited into another city where you have to go through the work of getting yourself acquainted with a whole new set of characters, and it is a bit jolting. The stories of the rise and falls of each revolutionary government can start to feel a bit repetitive after a while. And I do have a confession to make. I actually bought this book years before I sat down and read it cover to cover. So it's one of those books I would start frequently, flip through it from time to time, but just couldn't bring myself to actually read through it cover to cover, in spite of the fact that it's very well written. But I think the reason is because it's just a little bit too jolting to kind of get acquainted with all these different cities. However, with a little bit of self-discipline, I found that I was able to stick through it, and I gradually got immersed into each separate story if I just stuck with the book. And because Robertson's prose works so hard to recreate the feelings and atmosphere of 1848, I had the pleasure of feeling like I was transported to several different exotic cities in 19th century Europe. The reader of this book gets to spend time in revolutionary Paris, the student government in Vienna, Milan, Rome, Venice, Frankfurt, Dresden, various cities in Hungary, etc. For somebody like me, who has still to this day never been to Europe, it was a great way to visit all these cities vicariously, and all the cities were very well described. There were a lot of, there were a lot of emotions in the 1848 revolutions, and Robertson does a good job of guiding us through them all. At the outbreak of the revolutions, we can feel the romanticism at the plans and the dreams for various utopian republics. As Philip Robertson writes, all schools of romantic thought had their day in 1848. That's from page 367. Once the new governments began to crumble, the early optimistic feeling all too quickly leads to despair, which Robertson also captures. Of the various people she quotes, perhaps the Russian socialist Herzen describes the feeling most eloquently. Quote, "Half of our hopes, half of our beliefs were slain. Ideas of skepticism and despair haunted the brain and took root in it. One could never have supposed that after passing through so many trials, after being schooled by contemporary skepticism, we had so much left in our souls to be destroyed." That's from page 96 of the book. So, once the Republican governments crumbled, the old reactionary order reasserted itself, and reasserted itself quite brutally. There were a number of civilian massacres when these republics fell, and Robertson records this. Also interesting, 1848 stands at the crossroads of history in more ways than one, and Robertson explores many of these. For one thing, 1848 was the last bourgeois revolution, at least in Europe. So it represents the split between the Republicans and the Socialists. So under the old monarchist system, both the businesses and the workers felt like they were being oppressed by monarchism and feudalism, which caused both of them to be at the forefront of the revolution. Again, quoting from the book, Philip Robertson says, quote, "1848 was the last time that business could seem radical." She's talking about the revolution in Vienna from page 206. So before 1848, there was this idea that if you just had a Republican revolution, it would take care of the class problem. After 1848, it became obvious that the workers and the industrialists, the bourgeoisie class, were pitted against each other. Quoting again from the book, page 6, "Only after the liberals won power did they discover that they were afraid of the workers. When the workers found this out, they turned to Marxian gospel." That's from page 6. Another interesting thing about this book is 1848 also saw the emergence of nationalism as a popular force. So the desire for various German and Italian states to unite as one country. Also in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there was a lot of desire for the various ethnic groups to have their own country, which for a brief moment looked like it was going to work out, and then it just got crushed again by the empires. But Robertson points out that if this could have been solved in 1848, we could have avoided a lot of the bloodshed of the 20th century, right? World War I started because of the nationalists within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Arguably, a lot of World War II had its roots in the national problems of Europe. Now, because the action of this book spans a whole continent, it takes into its scope some of the most prominent names of the time. So there are a lot of names in this book. Garibaldi, Manzini, Bakunin, George Sand, Marx and Engels, Jacob Grimm, and yes, this Jacob Grimm, the brothers Grimm, Jacob Grimm, he was a prominent politician in Germany during the time of 1848, and he's featured in this book. Metternich, Richard Wagner, the famous opera composer Richard Wagner, was on the barricades in the Revolution of 1848 in Dresden. Herzen, Proudhon, they all figure prominently in this book. But that's just the big names. Besides these, the reader has to keep track of so many more names. In each revolution, in each city, there are the politicians associated with the old regime, there are the politicians associated with the moderates, there are the politicians associated with the Republicans, and there are the people associated with the radicals. So in each city, you have each of these four groups. So it is a lot of names to keep track of. And I was constantly going back to the index to remind me of who was who. Fortunately, the index for this book is excellent. It is so thorough. So, you know, if you don't mind flipping back and forth to the index every now and again, you're in good hands with this book. The index helped me keep track of who was who. One last thought before I finish off this book. Before I finish off this review. One of the interesting things about this was the problems of trying to have Republican revolutions in countries or cities that did not have Republican traditions. For example, sometimes the radicals in the city would have a Republican revolution, but then the conservatives in the countryside would either not support the Republican revolution, or when they opened it up to a vote, they just vote in conservatives who wanted to go back to the old order. I mean, apparently this was a paradox at the time. If you open up universal suffrage so that everyone could vote, what happens if all the peasants vote for the king to come back? It reminded me, or it struck me as particularly relevant because I was reading this book about 10 years ago when the experiments with the US government trying to set up Republican governments in Iraq and Afghanistan were still very much in the news at that time. They've somewhat faded out of the news since then, but I thought this book could have some relevance on that question. Okay, so that's all for this book review. I can't recommend this book highly enough. If you're a history nerd, you're going to love this book. Definitely check it out.